All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Spartan Talks. For those who don't know me, my name is Sam Chen. I have the privilege of serving our faculty here at Northampton Community College and serving as your host of Spartan Talks. Super excited for our talk today. My good friend and colleague, Jason Horowitz, a colleague of mine here in political science, will be joining us and for an absolutely fascinating talk about narratives and how our understanding of narratives affect our perception of conflict. Jason Horowitz has been teaching here at Northampton since the fall of 2020, and he teaches in our political science department, teaches Introduction to Political Science, International Relations, as well as American National Government. He holds his bachelor's degree in political science and history from the University of Pittsburgh, go Panthers, and he also has a master's in government diplomacy and conflict studies from Reichman University. Jason is actually joining us from our nation's capital in Washington, D.C., where he resides and works today. And his talk today will be looking at the intractable conflicts as they've existed for centuries. And he will be discussing how narratives have shaped one of the most well-known intractable conflicts of the modern era, and what we tend to forget about when conflict arises. That's a fascinating talk, especially in our current day and age with politics and with the rise of interest in international relations. And so I'm super excited to have Jason with us. Without any further ado, then, please join me in welcoming Jason Horowitz.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sam, for the introduction. I'm not even going to say anything else about myself because Sam did such a wonderful job. It's great to be speaking with all of you. I'm really excited to talk to all of you about how narrative shapes our perception of conflict. And while we are going to talk about, as Sam mentioned, a particular conflict that is happening today, my hope is that the lessons that we take from this conversation can be applied to all types of conflicts in the world. Now, as again, Sam mentioned in the introduction, we are talking about intractable conflicts. Now, what are intractable conflicts? Because they're different than unintractable conflicts. So what's an intractable conflict? Well, an intractable conflict is also really known as an unsolvable conflict. And there are 7 characteristics to an intractable conflict. And this is going to be really important to remember when we're talking about the conflict that we're discussing today. So there are 7 characteristics to an intractable conflict. The first is that they are total. They are over essential and existential goals. So it could be land, it could be money, it could be economy, it could be all sorts of things, but it is something that both sides want all of. They are violent. So these types of conflicts have lots of death, lots of injuries, lots of casualties on both sides and are carried out by the members of each side. So they are attacking one another and there is, again, lots of loss of life. They are zero sum. So anytime one side has something positive happen, that is automatically seen as a loss for the other side and vice versa. They are central. So this conflict preoccupies members of each society and they are easily accessible. So it is something that you are seeing every day, whether you are being conscripted to the army, whether you are walking by and there is a military presence from the other side, whether you have family members who have been killed in this conflict. You are dealing with this every single day of your life. They are perceived as unsolvable. So that means that there have been numerous attempts by each side to negotiate, to talk, to try to compromise, and nothing has changed. The negotiations have failed and have led to even more conflict. They demand great investments. So as I mentioned before, people who join armies or resistance groups, they are putting their lives at risk. There is economical impact. So countries are putting lots of their gross domestic product or lots of their investments into maintaining this conflict. And then finally, they're protracted. So intractable conflicts are not conflicts that take place over the span of a few months. These are conflicts that have happened for centuries or decades. And in fact, the conflict that we're going to be talking about has been going on arguably for at least a century. So those are the 7 characteristics of an intractable conflict. But before we get into our conflict specifically, I want to have a scenario played out for all of you, and I want to hear your thoughts. So the first scenario is, let's say that there's a family who's lived in their home for decades. And one day, someone shows up, they declare that this was once their home, they'd been removed against their will, and they want it back. They have no other place to go. So what do you say to them? And I'm definitely open to hearing what people think. So what would people say?
I would say, show me the evidence that it was your home.
Okay, thank you, Donna. Show me the evidence that's your home. Why should I believe that you had any connection to this home? Great. Anyone else?
I would just say, well, I live here now, so I'm not moving.
Okay, yeah. Tough noogies. This is my home now. Like, I don't have to leave because you want this place back. Great. Anyone else?
Jason, I'm curious. I think I would probably ask about why they want it back, and if there's any chance that they'd be like, if we could find them another place to go, would that be sufficient, or do they have to have this home back? And if so, why? What's the significance of it?
Sam, that's a great question. And I think it sort of goes back to actually what's going to be the next part of the scenario, which is both families actually claim that they've been persecuted by others and they've been kicked out of their homes wherever they've lived. So to answer your question, Sam, these people don't have any other place to go because wherever they go, they've been attacked or killed or kicked out. And on both sides, many of their brethren have been killed and discriminated against. And the only place that both sets of people feel safe is in this particular home, which they both claim to be theirs. So what do you tell them? What do you tell these people that only feel like they can live in this one place?
Gosh, I don't know what to tell them, but I can say that what comes to my mind is what not me, did to the first Americans that lived here, who had they have such a deep connection with their land, and then the forced removal off that land, and that land ties to their ancestors, it ties to their culture, it ties to everything about them. So it's really tough. I don't have an answer.
Well, that answer was a good response, Donna. So thank you so much. Does anyone else want to add something in?
I would say, like, how can we work together in some way?
How can we work together? Thank you, Hope. So there are really no good answers here. And that is sort of the crux of the situation, that no matter what scenario you want to provide to fix this problem, well, we're an intractable conflict here. So there is really no good answer. And this is very representative of what's happening today in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. You have two sides who have very distinct narratives, who don't really talk to each other, and it's affecting people day to day. So what we're going to do for this particular conflict is we're going to start at the macro level of narrative and work our way down to the micro level to see how ingrained each side is in their particular narrative and why nothing is changing and what we can do about it. So I've already told you what the name of the conflict is, but I want you to tell me who can guess what the name of all of this land is, not just the darker blue, but the lighter blue too. What is the name of this land?
Israel.
I heard people say Israel. Okay, are there any other? What
I
would
just said, is it a trick question? Because it looks like Israel to me.
Mhm. Well, it depends on who you talk to. And that's the crux of the situation here. So for the Jewish Israeli narrative, this is part of Eretz Yisrael, or the land of Israel, or today as we know it, the modern state of Israel. But wait, that's not the only narrative here. The Arab Palestinian narrative is that this is the land of Palestine, or the state of Palestine, or the future state of Palestine. So just the land itself, we can't agree on a name. Now, what if I said, what's this shaded land here where the arrow is pointing? What would you call that, this particular territory? This might be a little bit trickier. So the name of this land, well, the Jewish Israeli narrative is that this is Judea and Samaria, part of biblical Israel, where major Jewish and Hebrew events have taken place. Modern day Israel would also call them shtachim, which are territories. But that's not what Palestinians call them, and Arabs call it. Palestinians would call it part of Palestine, or Palestine, or the West Bank, because it's on the west bank of the Jordan River. So right where I'm pointing, that's the Jordan River going into the Dead Sea. So what we're seeing here is the larger land. We don't have a name for it. We can't agree on a name. We go deeper into a particular part of the land. We still can't come up with a name that everyone can agree on. Now we're going to go deeper. So let's look at this particular photo right here. Now, we're not going to look at the particular place itself yet, but who knows where this is located?
I'm guessing Jerusalem.
Okay, Jerusalem. Yes. So again, that is a narrative. For Palestinians and Arabs, though, this is the city of Al-Quds. They don't call it Jerusalem. So how can we expect people who are living on top of each other, Jews and Arabs, to come together when they can't even agree on the name of a country, the name of a city? For Jews and Israelis, they call it Yerushalayim, as Donna mentioned, another name for Jerusalem. So even the city that people live in have different names. There are other cities in the land that have different names. There's a city called Lod, which is the Israeli name. Arabs and Palestinians would call it Lida, because it used to be an Arab town before the founding of the state. So let's go a little bit deeper. I just showed you that landmark. What's this landmark called? And I'm talking specifically about this golden dome where it sits. Okay, I don't expect anyone to know this. Okay, so Arabs and Palestinians would call this the Al-Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary. And this is important because now we're bringing religion into the conversation. This is the third holiest site in Islam, where Muslims would say that Muhammad ascended to heaven. But wait, we're forgetting that in the Jewish Israeli narrative, this is the Har HaBayit, the Temple Mount. This is where the two Jewish temples stood. Many of you may have heard of King Solomon. This is where his temple stood. This is where many Jews hope to build a third temple, but they can't, because this is where a holy Muslim site is. So the closest that Jews can get to this site is right down here, which is the Western Wall, which is from the Second Temple period. But again, now we're bringing religion into the conversation. And that makes it even more complicated, because people are very passionate about their religion. So let's keep going further. And hopefully you're all understanding that as we're going more micro and micro, the more difficult it is to want to acknowledge the other side, because it becomes way more personal. So let's take a look at this photo right here and look at where this arrow is pointing. What can we see? What would we call this? And why do we call it what we call it? Well, from a Jewish Israeli narrative, this is a security barrier or separation wall. So this separates Israel from the West Bank or parts of the West Bank. And the reason why this was built from the Israeli narrative is because in the early 2000s, terrorists were coming over from the West Bank and blowing up buses and cafes and killing many, many people in the process, which we'll get to in a little bit about that time period. From a Arab-Palestinian narrative, this is an apartheid wall. This wall, this barrier, is separating Palestinians from their land. It doesn't just go over the border to the West Bank, but it goes deep into the West Bank and separates Palestinians from their land. Many Palestinians are olive tree farmers. They can't access that land because it's blocked by this wall. They have different IDs than Israelis, so they can't just cross over the wall to get to their land. So for Jews and Israelis, this is a safety net. This is something that's saving their lives. For Palestinians, this is something that is destroying their lives. And again, this is something that we're seeing on a daily basis. This is something that Jews and Arabs and Palestinians are living. So just very quickly, we're going to go deeper once again. We're going to talk about war, and we're going to talk about casualties and how it is seen by both sides. So the 1948 war, Jews and Israelis see this as the War of Independence. Israel coming back, victory after 2,000 years of statelessness for the Jewish people. They finally have a country of their own. For Arabs and Palestinians, this is what's known as the Nakba, or catastrophe. There were 500,000 Arabs that were displaced because of this. And we're still dealing with the refugee problem or issue from this conflict. We'll skip to the 1973 war for Jews and Israelis. This is known as the Yom Kippur War, which actually Yom Kippur is coming up next week in the Jewish calendar. This war, if we go back quickly to the Six-Day War, huge win for Israel. They tripled their size. The 1973 Yom Kippur War, while Israel won, they lost their feeling of invincibility. And it was the opposite for Arabs and Palestinians. In 1967, they were destroyed. All Arab countries that were in the war lost very quickly. But in 1973, they were able to gain some honor back, even though Israel won the war. And as you can see, I mentioned before in the early 2000s that the wall went up, or the security barrier went up to stop against terrorist attacks against Israelis. That's called an intifada, or an uprising. And it was a resistance from the Palestinian perspective against Israel, who they view as an occupying force. Many Palestinians don't even recognize Israel as a legitimate state. And many Israelis would not recognize Palestinians as a legitimate people. So hopefully what we're seeing is that this is really something that is taking up the day-to-day lives of the people living in this land. And they're living on top of each other. They're living in mixed cities. A lot of times they're living in cities next to each other, but they're not talking to each other because they see each other as the enemy. So what can we do? What can we do to solve this conflict? Well, if I had a silver bullet answer, I would probably have a Nobel Peace Prize. And the reality is there really is no good answer. But what I can tell you is if we just start to rethink how we view conflict and view the other side, then maybe there's a chance. And what we need to do first is we need to stop looking at the conflict as just about barriers. And we need to stop looking at the conflict as just about destruction. What we need to start to do is recognize that each side has a connection to this land, has history in this land, and start to have conversations, start to realize that it's okay to talk to someone who disagrees with you. It's okay to accept that there have been multiple people who have lived in this land at certain times. And I can go into answering about these photos as I'm going through at the end. And if we can start to do this, if we can start to recognize the humanity of the other side, we'll remember that this conflict is about people who are living this every single day. And this conflict is about children who are growing up in a situation that they didn't create. And if we can begin to accept the humanity of the other side, then maybe what we can do is break bread with each other and sit down and have a conversation. And what better way to sit down and have a conversation than over food? Food is something that we can all get behind. Every country, every culture, every people has a specific type of dish that they enjoy, that they want to share with other people. And in this instance, Israelis and Palestinians have amazing, amazing food. The beauty of some of these photos is that you don't know which side is which. You don't know if this is Palestinian food, if this is Israeli food. You don't know if what those barriers were, where they were. You don't know whose house was destroyed. You don't know whose children those were. So it's very, very mixed together. And the hope is that we can intermingle more and recognize each other's humanity, hopefully over food, then maybe there's a chance for ending this intractable conflict in the near future. So what would you do in a situation like this?
I mean, these are tough questions, right? Because like, I mean, one of my bigger, I think, questions has to do as well with, so for the most part, how many outside actors are backing each side that would allow sort of additional pressure for both sides not to, let's say, give in, meet in the middle, right? So how many third parties are participating in this conflict as well?
So it's a really, really great question. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen in a second, but here's the reference for quickly what an intractable conflict is. It's a really good question. And I think the reality is on the ground today, there are actors within those societies that are very radical, very much on each side. So, and they're the loudest. So they don't allow for negotiations to really happen. They don't really allow for compromise to move forward. And when compromise has happened, and we'll look at the Oslo Accords, which were in the early 90s, that was supposed to lead to a Palestinian state. Hamas, which was mentioned in the presentation, they started blowing up buses. An Israeli Jew murdered the prime minister of Israel because he was against compromise with Palestinians. So there's self-destruction within each society. Outside of those societies, you have, the United States is a big backer of Israel. I wouldn't say they are doing anything in particular to keep Israel from making peace, or reaching out. But on the other side, there are segments of Palestinian society that are supported by Iran, that are supported by Saudi Arabia, that are supported by members of the Arab and Muslim world that don't even believe that Israel has the right to exist. So they're getting a lot of monetary support from them. So plus there's money coming from all other directions, from the Jewish community in the United States for Israel, and there's a growing support network for Palestinians from more progressive members of American society. So there's a lot of third-party actors is what I'm trying to get at, which makes it way tougher to, bring sides together for a compromise.
I'll just throw in a little my own experience. I think that on a more micro level, where it's people to people and over food and that type of thing, that there is a lot of talk going on, and that there is that people do get along. But I think it's the overarching policies that are created by the larger entities of government that restrict compromises from being made. And I think it goes back to what you said about being so radical. Like there's just so much, one side is so deeply passionate about what they feel, and so is the other side. And yet there are people in the middle. And I think if you were to ask a lot of Israelis that they want peace, people want peace. I don't think people want to live in this type of situation, but like you say, the land, and like Donna had mentioned before about what we did here, the land is so powerful for these both groups. It's like, how do we compromise? So it's not, it's people to people. People are talking, people are working together, I think. But I think the bigger issue is more the macro policies that are created that don't allow for really the peace at the lower level. And I went experience going to a kindergarten where it was an Israeli man married a Palestinian woman, which was like, oh my God. And they wound up opening a kindergarten with kids sharing everything. And it's like that stuff goes on, but it's not powerful enough to change the narrative on the bigger level.
And I'll also add just very quickly that while we're talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict here, that the lessons from this conversation can be applied to any type of intractable conflict. I just happen to be talking about this conflict because that's what my background is in. So for people who are worried that this can't be applied to intractable conflicts that have been solved. So for example, South Africa was an intractable conflict. Northern Ireland was an intractable conflict. Sri Lanka was an intractable conflict. Those were conflicts that were solved. They're not necessarily over yet. There's still aftermath of those conflicts, but some of the lessons that we're talking about here were applied to those other conflicts and helped. So hopefully something can happen similarly in a situation like this. What other questions do people have about Israel, Palestine, anything related to conflict, anything that stood out to them?
And if you have a question, you're also welcome to drop it in the chat. And that way both Jason and I can see that. Or feel free to unmute and just ask.
I think that zero-sum part of the intractable conflict is quite telling, because it's like there's got to be a winner and a loser. It's never where it can be both parties, where it's like, oh, okay, we can compromise and make it work. So I think that kind of stands out in my head in terms of these kind of conflicts.
What's coming to me is all the work around restorative justice processes. And I wonder how that I know nothing about this, so I'm just, off the top of my head wondering, though, is that a place to start?
Yeah, so there's two comments there. So the first comment about the zero sum, I am Jewish. I have been involved in this for a long time, and I try to be as neutral as possible when talking about the situation. But I can tell you, when something bad happens to Israel, even if it's not something I totally disagree with, I still feel that sense of, oh, that hurts. And vice versa. I can only imagine when something positive happens for Israel, how someone from Palestine or a Palestine supporter would feel. Referring to Donna, your restorative justice, there are groups, as Hope said, that are trying to do that in Israel. And in fact, there's someone from Allentown who I grew up with who created a NGO in Israel that works with Israelis and Palestinians. They fundraise for more or less restorative justice organizations to bring Israelis and Palestinians together and have conversations about the experiences that each side has had, starting from kids to adults. So it's there, but it's not getting the support that it needs on a ground level to make, I think, a huge dent in changing the conflict.
How do you get the leaders of the conflict into restorative justice programs and practices? That maybe it has to start there.
Yeah, and if I had an answer to that, I think we'd be in a better place. I think you have to look at how their governments are shaped. If you're looking at the West Bank, the territory that we showed before, that's ruled by an authority, a Palestinian authority, whose president was supposed to be, who's been in power for like 20 something years, but they were supposed to have elections, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So he might be the leader, but he may not be seen as the legitimate leader of them. From an Israeli side, they're pretty much in a quagmire in terms of their government. I think they're going on their 5th election now in 3 years, because their government is so divided that they can barely keep it. They can barely keep it going. They have 120 people in their parliament, and if you can't get 61 seats, you can't have a government. And if you look at the past Israeli elections, both sides are pretty much getting 61 seats. So it's really a tenuous government at best. So it's hard to get government leaders to be part of these things when the government may not even last long enough for them to be involved.
Well, with that being said, I mean, can I ask, like, how much of these types of situations historically need to be solved by outside parties? So, like, how much does the international community need to come in and further, let's say, interfere into what's already a, ghost war, domestic, turmoil, to have these things sort of reach some better state of stability or peace? Or is this something that, historically should be left alone to the parties involved?
It's a really good question. I think people will have to decide, again, if this is a top-down approach where, the United States exerts its influence and says, hey, Israel, like, we're going to withdraw support for you unless you do X, Y, and Z. Same with, Saudi Arabia or Iran putting pressure on Palestinians. I don't know, but if you look at like South Africa, for example, that's an example where the international community sort of came in and pressured the South African government to end apartheid with economic sanctions, with diplomatic sanctions. At the same time, I don't think you can really have a stable peace if the people living it day to day are not bought in. And for some of these other countries, the groundswell of support for change on both sides is what led to, compromise. So South Africa, again, I'll use it as an example. They created peace and reconciliation commissions where people who were experiencing apartheid were able to go and share their experiences, in some cases get compensation, but it was really an opportunity for people to talk and listen to each other. I actually think that's something that could be really cool on a wider scale for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. What happened before the early 2000s when the Intifada happened, Israel was controlling the West Bank, but Israelis were going in, they were meeting Palestinians, they were buying and shopping for them and interacting. And that security barrier or apartheid wall, once it was built, completely separated them. So there is a whole generation of Israelis and Palestinians who just do not interact with each other. Israelis view Palestinians as, for lack of a better term, terrorists who want to come in and kill them. And Palestinians only really interact with Israeli soldiers, and in some cases, Israeli settlers, which are Israeli citizens who live in the West Bank. So it's more violent than it was in certain ways. So I think if there was more support for these grassroots movements on the ground who were trying to bring people together, I think you would start to see more of a groundswelling of support for something to change on a grander scale.
Yeah, it would seem to me that you have to have buy-in from the people there. You can't, in order for compromise to happen, everybody needs to feel like they have had a say in it and not some top-down, we're going to tell you how to live your life. Because the culture, it's all about culture. It's all about the power of culture. And like you said, the tide of the land.
Yeah, I mean, and you're seeing that today. I'll give two examples of peace agreements that Israel has with some Arab countries. Israel has peace with Jordan and Egypt, but Egyptian people and Jordanian people do not like Israel. And if they had their choice, they would probably not have diplomatic relations with Israel. However, the Abraham Accords, which were signed in the last few years, so Israel has relations now with Bahrain and the UAE and Morocco. You're seeing Israel and the UAE. There is such people-to-people contact now that both countries are benefiting from that in a different way. And I think that if that had been the case with Israel and with Egypt and Jordan, that might be a different peace. That's a warm peace between Israel and a country like the UAE. And it's a very cold peace between Israel and countries like Jordan and Egypt.
Jason, question for you. You mentioned the intractable conflicts in places like South Africa that have been largely resolved. I mean, perhaps not completely over, but how different is it with Palestine, Israel, in the terms that this is one that is often driven by religion, and even their claims to the land and their history is driven by profound religious differences? And I think sometimes in the West, we don't always understand the role that religion plays as in the depth of a national identity. Is it harder to resolve such intractable conflicts when they are rooted in something that is as deeply embedded into DNA as religion? And does that make it different from, for example, the situation in South Africa?
Well, I would say that every intractable conflict or any conflict in general is different. And I think that's really important to understand, because there are people today who will, there are segments of world society who will call Israel an apartheid state. And for many pro-Israel supporters, they would argue like, no, it's not, because it's not the same as South Africa. So we need to recognize that all conflicts have their unique backgrounds and histories, and to try to compare one conflict to another is not going to get you anywhere. Now, there may be similarities, and I would say, Sam, the Northern Ireland conflict is quite similar, because it was a battle between Catholics and Protestants. Excuse me. So I do think it makes it more difficult, because Jews see themselves as an ethno-religion. So not just a religion, but a culture and a people as well. Palestinians and Arabs only see Jews through the lens of religion. So even from that perspective, there's a difference in how people view each other and how they see the conflict. I also think, we talked about the Temple Mount, we talked about Al-Haram al-Sharif, like the main religious site for Judaism is under the third holiest Muslim site. So, and there are constant conflicts over that. Jews going up there and having rocks thrown at them, Jews going to pray there when they're not supposed to be praying there. So yeah, it's a whole other level of conflict and disagreement that, if you go back to 2000, Bill Clinton was negotiating with the Israeli leader and the Palestinian leader, and they were very, very close to a peace agreement. But where they couldn't agree was that Israel wanted to be able to dig under this area for Jewish history, and Palestinians said no, that they didn't want that, because the thought process was, if Jews can legitimize their claim to this, it's going to undermine our ability to lay claim to the top part. And the negotiations broke down. It's actually one of the things that led to the Intifada, the second Intifada. So it is very, very deeply rooted, and Palestinians are mainly Muslim, but there's a Christian segment to them too. But they're very religious. They very much follow Islam. You go all over the West Bank, and in Israel, there are mosques everywhere. And same with Israel. From a Western, like you said, Sam, from a Western perspective, we see religion. We see things through the lens of religion. So, I'm Jewish, but I'm American, so I go to synagogue here. Israelis, their religion is also their nationality. So they have off for Jewish holidays. There are synagogues everywhere. They eat kosher. It's part of their identity. So it's another level of understanding that I don't think either side is really ready to acknowledge yet.
Any other questions for Professor Horowitz?
I don't have a question, but I can say that it's really a timely topic. And when you started talking, I was thinking about the Russia-Ukraine. It feels like an intractable conflict as well. And I don't think you have religion. You just have a maniacal dictator as the problem. But all of those things that you listed made me feel like that's part of their experience now.
And I was going to kind of comment on the same thing. Is I was going to ask a question about foreshadowing about the situation with Taiwan, right? Like, this is borderline an intractable conflict that's about to hit the larger stage. And the question then is sort of, is it possible to curb this before it gets to that level? And once again, who are the actors involved in that process?
So I was actually thinking about the Russia-Ukraine conflict earlier as well. I don't think we're quite at intractable conflict yet, because even though both sides see things differently, it hasn't been going on long enough for it to be considered intractable. I don't think it's quite total yet either. For the Ukrainians, yes, every day they're living it, but I don't think it's quite total yet for Russians. I think it's getting there because they just are conscripting everyone now. They're doing call-ups, which they haven't done since World War II. So now they're starting to get more members of their society involved. If the conflict continues and there's negotiations and nothing gets solved, then I think you would start to see it turn intractable if there's really no agreement to stop the war. With Taiwan, I'm not as well versed in Taiwan, so I'll keep that a little bit briefer. I would say it's more of a Cold War situation where China and Taiwan don't get along. I don't think it's violent yet. It might get violent. Like if China were to invade Taiwan and occupy them, and there was resistance from Taiwanese people, and that went on for maybe a few decades, then yes, I would argue that's probably an intractable conflict because there are two sides fighting against each other. I think intractable conflicts are rare, but when they happen, they are conflicts that dominate the airwaves. They're conflicts that take over the conversation. South Africa. I wasn't in college in the early 90s, but I know that on college campuses, a lot of student governments were coming out against South Africa because of their support of apartheid. I think that actually the Darfur conflict in Sudan, from when I was an undergrad, I think that you could consider an intractable conflict because that had really been going on for years, but really got the press that it was getting in that time period, in like the 05 to 09 time period. So, but there are other conflicts in the world that are happening that are not intractable, but are just as bad. They just might not have all those characteristics. So the second you take out one of those characteristics from an intractable conflict and you fix it, it is no longer intractable. It is therefore a solvable conflict.
Other questions?
So I'll just say quickly, a lot of the photos that I shared in the presentation were photos that I've taken. I've experienced this as much as I can. It is like part of my professional career, my full-time career. So I do take it very seriously, and I try to be as nuanced as possible in those conversations. I think the only ones that I didn't take were the ones of destruction, because I didn't feel like that would be, I don't have any photos, thank God, of that. But, you know, for my family, it does go back. One of the photos that I did in the territory history was a photo of my great grandmother, Molly, who was at the Western Wall in Jerusalem in 1935. So it does affect people not living there. You know, I'm not Israeli, I am very much American, but it affects the people that you know. I have friends in Israel, I have friends in Palestine, who are fighting the good fight to make life better for each other. And then the other thing I'll just say is if people do have questions that they want to know more about, especially if people are going to be watching the recording, you can reach out to me and email me. And I'm happy to have a conversation with you about it. I'm also happy to lead this presentation for a class if anyone's interested. I've done this in the past for some professors. So I will leave it at that.
And I just put Professor Horace's email in the chat for those who want to reach out to him. Well, that concludes our Spartan Talk for today. And so, Jason, again, thank you for joining us, and thank you for that presentation. I certainly learned and gained a lot from it, as I always do in our conversations. And so I want to thank all of you for joining us. We have several more Spartan Talks throughout the semester, so stay tuned to your email for more announcements that are coming out. And then Jason, also just want to thank him. We had to move around his talk a little bit, and so did not realize that we're holding this in the middle of the high holidays for you. So a happy Rosh Hashanah, and praying for an easy fast for you next week with Yom Kippur.
Thank you.
Certainly, thanks again for joining us, and wishing you all the best. So we'll see you guys at our next Spartan Talk, and that will wrap it up for today. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Jason.